Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Welcome to the Imaginaries podcast, where we discuss imaginary things, as you probably expected. My name is Kendra, and I am here today with my co-host, Tony.
That is correct.
So, Tony, we're going to talk about the second beauty of science fiction as laid out in the 7 Beauties of Science Fiction, a book by Istvan Csicsery-Ronay Jr. We have already discussed the first beauty a while ago, so you might not remember it. However, I'm really excited about today's podcast because I personally find the second beauty amongst the most fascinating discussions of science fiction in general that I've read lately. So, first of all, I thought it would be great if you could lead us off with a basic summary description of what the second beauty is.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about the science fictional novum.
What's a novum?
Csicsery-Ronay describes the novum very succinctly, and then we'll get a little less succinct, but very succinctly as the central imaginary novelty of any work of science fiction. So whatever the central new thing is, that is the novum.
Okay, so I know in first reading this chapter, the thing that immediately leapt to my mind was, he's talking about the MacGuffin. And for those of you listeners who are familiar with the term MacGuffin, great. If you're not familiar, the MacGuffin is a sort of slang term for, as tvtropes.org puts it, the motivating element in a story that is used to drive the plot. The article here also continues to define the MacGuffin as serving no further purpose. Like, it won't pop up again later. It's essentially warp drive. That is a MacGuffin. However, that's not really what Csicsery-Ronay is trying to talk about, is it?
Not exactly. So there are a couple of less succinct definitions that either he uses or he quotes others as using. Darko Suvin is one of the major luminaries in science fiction studies, and he's quoted throughout the second beauty of science fiction. If you have not yet listened to the first podcast and the first beauty of science fiction, we're referring here to the 7 Beauties of Science Fiction, which is a book of science fiction scholarship by Istvan Csicsery-Ronay Jr.
It's pretty heady stuff. It's very, very technical in a analytic sense.
Definitely. Which is to say, it's very enjoyable, but there are parts of it that are definitely going to be tough to get through, no matter who you are, unless you are.
Right.
Well, probably no matter who you are.
I mean, I don't know. I think if you're a nerd and you enjoy deconstructing texts of some kind, it would be enjoyable. However, if you are the sort of person who enjoys a text only if you're not thinking analytically about it, and my sister happens to be one of these people, so I know they exist. You're out there, you're valid, your habits are valid, whether you're reading a book or watching a television show or watching a movie, it's valid. I get it. It's good. But you probably wouldn't want to read this book.
Probably not.
We want to read this book.
Yeah. Yeah, so what Csicsery-Ronay quotes Suvin as saying are let's go ahead and say the 3 important, not conditions, constituents, the 3 important constituents of the science fictional novum. Suvin says the authentic novum should be imminent, scientifically apprehendable, and validated by cognitive logic.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit, though.
Yes, for sure.
What does he mean by imminent? Because I'm pretty sure he doesn't mean imminent domain.
No, that would be eminent. So here he
Correct.
Imminent domain would be a domain that's about to happen. I'm not really sure. Anyway, but he definitely means imminent in, well, I can't say what he means. What I think he means is that, I think he means imminent in a temporal sense, in that this novum is a piece of technology or a discovery or some sort of invention that maybe we don't quite know how to do it yet, but it's within the realm of possibility.
Okay.
And
scientifically apprehendable, though, that could be the same thing.
Right, definitely. So, but it doesn't include the out and out temporal marker. So scientifically apprehendable just means we could maybe with some science figure out what's going on here. But add that to imminent, and then you say, well, it's something that is coming, and we could understand it scientifically.
And the validated by cognitive logic? What's up with that?
So there are things that we could understand. Say, oh Lord, okay, that was a bad example. But
that wasn't an example.
I know. What I was thinking was a bad example. But validated by cognitive logic, that's just sort of saying, what I see makes sense. So it's not fantastical. We can understand it scientifically, but that's the scientifically apprehendable part.
Yeah, okay. So I don't think fantastical is an appropriate word to use in this case, because it can be fantastical. Many novums are fantastical.
Yeah.
I think what he's trying to get at, right, is more to do with within the world that's being set up, whether it's far future or near future or alternate universe or fantasy universe, the way that the novum is working, it feels a part of the whole. It doesn't feel like a thing that happens so that you can get somewhere else. Like, it feels like it's both required by the situation and a natural consequence of the situation. I mean, is that closer?
Well, I would agree with you as far as what Csicsery-Ronay is saying in this book. I would also agree with you as a reader of science fiction, of fantasy, of science fantasy, of things that don't quite fit into the categories. But I want to just make a note that the definition I just read with the three constituents is specifically Darko Suvin, who is speaking again specifically to like hard science fiction. So things like fantasy wouldn't be included in that. Things even like science fantasy wouldn't be included in that. So this is speaking specifically to novums from hard science fiction via this definition.
It's probably worth repeating at this point, too, something that we said in our first podcast about this book, that we're not interested in analyzing Csicsery-Ronay, who is analyzing all of these other texts.
No,
we are responding to the core principles as laid out and applying them to texts in what we find in an enlightening way, or perhaps trying to figure out what we can learn from this book that enriches our understanding of science fiction as we watch and read it.
Definitely. So I want to open that up from Suvin's kind of like very strict straitjacket of a definition to another...
It's very strict.
Yeah, very strict. To another definition that Csicsery-Ronay puts out there, which is more of like a fan definition, which I appreciate. He says that the science fictional novum emphasizes, quote, the desire by readers to experience novelty not merely as entertaining ideas and techniques, but as an essential quality of the fiction. End quote.
Oh, I love that. And I love that because it just feels right as someone who perhaps feels a little out of joint with the real world, for lack of a better word, real.
Yes.
I find when I'm reading a text, if it feels too close to the real world without somehow reimagining our place in it or our possibility for progressing beyond it, then I get very depressed. So I find science fiction hopeful and optimistic even when we're talking about a devastated, bleak nuclear wasteland, simply because it provides us with new opportunities to tackle the world and re-envision our place in it.
Yeah, for sure. And that's why, so the simpler definition of the novum, the central imaginary novelty, coupled with this quote that novums, when they are central imaginary novelties, emphasize the desire by readers to experience novelty not merely as entertaining ideas and techniques, but as essential qualities of fiction. I agree. I think that absolutely speaks to what I'm looking for when I read science fiction or fantasy or view it or look at anything that's a little bit or a lot off kilter from the world that I experience. I want that.
Sure.
And I want it to be essential in the way that Csicsery-Ronay is suggesting there.
Well, yeah, and I think circling back to our discussion of MacGuffins and how novums are not MacGuffins, the clearest distinction I can draw is that a MacGuffin is a thing that lets you get the book done or that makes the book happen.
Yeah.
The novum is the soul of the book.
Yeah.
The thing that allows the world to transgress the ordinary boundaries of fiction and take over your imagination in a really unique and wholehearted fashion.
Yeah, so. I agree. And I think that's just right. And I would actually add on to that the MacGuffin is something both within the world of the fiction and within the world of the writer, so the real world, that's kind of a device of convenience, a deus ex machina. Whereas a novum is really more about possibility. Like, I know we're going to talk a little bit later about some novums that we have identified in works of science fiction and fantasy. And we're interested to hear from our listeners if there are any that you would add to that list as particularly important.
I mean, why don't we just launch into that right now, actually, and circle back to talking about the usefulness of picking out the novums, because I think highlighting a few of them as examples will allow us to see whether it's useful or not.
Definitely.
Kind of the proof is in the pudding. So some of the examples that Csicsery-Ronay himself gives include Star Trek, Solaris, Philip K. Dick, and those are the ones that I remember as being rather central to this chapter in his mind. So he talks about the intergalactic governance of Star Trek as being the novum, not the warp engines, not the alien races or any individual relationship between alien and human, which is a novum in various other texts. But here, he thinks that what's really visionary, what really opens up possibilities in the Star Trek universe is this intergalactic governance. And based on our earlier discussion in a former podcast about Star Trek, I'm thinking you might agree. What do you think?
When I saw that, I was I'll say first that I was a little taken aback because of all of Star Trek across hundreds upon hundreds of episodes of, 5, 6, almost 7 different TV series now across over a dozen movies. There are so many things that could be considered novums, whether they're on the movie level or the episode level or the series level. And yet Star Trek as a whole, identifying the Federation as the novum for Star Trek is such an interesting thing because I agree, but I don't know that if someone had said prior to me hearing that, what is the novum of Star Trek? I don't know that I would have said the Federation. I probably would have gone with warp drive, honestly. I might have gone with, various other technologies or, the ability to, no, probably it would be that. But all of that is to say, I like thinking about the Federation and its intergalactic governance as the novum for Star Trek because it really helps to illustrate in my mind why Star Trek is this optimistic utopian science fiction. Because you can have, like you said, tons of science fiction where the warp drive or some other piece of technology is the novum. And that's fine, and we'll talk about some where that's true. But having sort of this, sort of putting Star Trek out there as social science fiction, where the core science fictional concept is something more to do with political science or governance or, development is a really interesting idea. And I love that because for me, Star Trek is at its best when it's really tackling those human questions and seeing what its characters do and being character driven and not being...
Which is...
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. I was just going to say, which is why you recommended for people who haven't watched a lot of Star Trek before but are interested in figuring out the core values of this world, you recommended that they watch The Unexplored Country. Is that the title?
The Undiscovered Country.
Undiscovered. I knew. Okay. The Undiscovered Country.
Ooh.
Because that is so much the intergalactic governance. It's the heart of that movie. And if we're on target at all, then I think we would agree with this particular identification of novum in Star Trek.
Yes.
But moving on to another example.
Yeah, so Csicsery-Ronay puts Solaris out there as an example of the pure novum. And I made a note for myself, do not say the pure novum, but I just did. So I think what he's actually implying there is not that Solaris is like the pinnacle of some hierarchy of novums, but rather that Solaris itself is pure novum. It is central imaginary novelty. Written as the point of the book, in that we don't understand it, we can't understand it, we spend the book trying to understand it, and yet it is so novel, so unknown, so alien, that it is pretty much like someone said to Stanislaw Lem, write a book about a novum. What else is the book about? It's about a novum, and that's Solaris.
I mean, and there are various other science fiction texts that do this
for sure
as their core. And there's some really wonderful, I would say, science fantasy books that really dive into it deeply. Have you read or watched Solaris?
I have both read and watched. Only one version of the movie, though. I watched the movie with George Clooney and not the original movie, but I've also read the book.
Everybody needs naked butt cheeks
obviously
in their Solaris. And it is worth noting for me that I encountered the George Clooney Solaris before I encountered any other Solaris as a college student. And I was immediately taken by it, by the complete incomprehensibility of it.
Yeah.
That the point was incomprehensibility.
Yep.
And having taken a class with Kate Bernheimer, a professor at the University of Arizona, dedicated entirely to fairy tales. And this is as a graduate student, mind. This is totally respectable and wonderful. And she's a world-renowned expert, so I stand my ground that it was a cool thing. This movie kept coming back to me as quintessential fairy tale. In that if you read a lot of Kate Bernheimer and her analyses of fairy tales, you'll begin to get a sense for fairy tale affect with an A as an atmosphere, as the soul of a text as well. And so there's something that they share, movies like Hannah and movies like Solaris, where the incomprehensibility and the complete unknowability of people and minds, because I would say that the planet is a mind.
Yeah, for sure.
That is like the fascination of the text itself. So I loved Solaris immediately based on its atmosphere, and a large part of the atmosphere is generated by its soundtrack by Cliff Martinez.
Oh, yeah.
That's just a gorgeous soundtrack, perfect for studying to.
Oh my God, you think so? I mean, I love that soundtrack, but it creeps me the fuck out.
Oh, it creeps you out? It's like relaxing to me. I don't know. Maybe I'm creepy then.
I mean, aren't all of us a little bit creepy?
We are. I guess my point is, though, in having fallen in love with this text, I didn't immediately feel the need to go back and watch the 60s, 70s adaptation.
Yeah, something like that.
I did not feel that need, but I was intrigued by the original written text. So, take it or leave it, whichever adaptation of Solaris you fall in love with, or if you dispense with adaptations altogether and stick with the written form, the point remains the same. And the novum remains the same. And I think that actually is the true mark of a successful adaptation. Like they knew what they were what the point of the book was.
Yeah.
So they stuck with that. Moving on to another example.
Yeah.
You might be more familiar with Philip K. Dick than I am.
Oh, I'm really
Philip K.
not.
Dick?
I read like one book by him a long time ago. We should skip him because I don't know a lot.
Okay. I mean, I have read Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and that might be the only full text of his that I have read. I am so sorry, Philip K. Dick. I do love you. I respect you.
I've tried to read him a couple of times and I just couldn't get through it. So, but I feel the same way about whatchamacallit, the other book that's the big cyberpunk book.
The big cyberpunk book.
Yeah. Like the thing.
There's a lot of big cyberpunk books. You're not thinking Snow Crash.
No, I'm thinking Neuromancer.
Oh, Neuromancer. Okay, yeah. And actually, I feel the same way about Dune. There are some books that are just impossible for me to fall in love with as much as I want to like them.
I tried to read Dune again about a year ago because the part of the reason why I got through Dune in the first place is that I listened to it as an audiobook, which was 7 fucking days of straight audio, first of all.
That's
torture. I tried to read it again and I just couldn't do it. So anyway.
The point is, if you were wondering what Csicsery-Ronay thought the novum in Philip K. Dick was, there's one universal one across almost everything he writes, and that's destabilized settings. Yeah. And that is actually also captured perfectly in Blade Runner, a very, very loose adaptation of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. So, yeah, that's a cool thing. Anyway, but moving on to maybe more current examples or examples that we are ourselves bringing to the story. Yeah. Do you have any that kind of leap to mind as any novums that you read or watched?
But you gave me a few ideas, and I particularly liked your identification of the culture series and its novum of the relationship between humans and minds. Because I think it would be very easy to say the central novum in culture are the minds themselves, or, the technology that allows the minds. But by saying that the novum is that relationship between humans and minds, or minds and other intelligent species, not necessarily just humans, again, it sort of rewrites the culture as having a focus on relationships between people and being driven by character and really interested in social science phenomena and not necessarily on natural science phenomena. And I think that's a really good way to think of the culture that I would not necessarily have thought of outside of this particular framing.
Wow, thank you. I mean, I think there's a lot of those novums, though, that are driven by relationships between different groups of people, species, etc. And another great example that leaps to mind is in The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin. And not only, I think there's several novums there, and we can talk about multiple novums in a minute, but one of the novums in The Dispossessed is the relationship between lunar and Terran systems of governance and the people groups there. So for context, those of you who haven't read it, the lunar culture is very egalitarian. I guess I would say that...
Anarchists. They're anarchists.
It's anarchist. It's straight up anarchist. What am I saying?
Yeah.
It's straight up anarchist. So it's the relationship between an anarchist group and a traditionally hierarchically structured earthbound government. So the ambassadors from the various groups meet and immerse themselves in the opposite culture. And that's just a really fascinating way to explore, this novum, I guess. I don't know. I don't know what I'm saying at this point, but I just think that relationship is one of the probably. I think relationship is one of the main branches of novum, or one of the main manifestations of novum. Yeah. Because when you talk about vacillating for a while between thinking of warp drive and other things in Star Trek various technologies as novums, I almost never associate novum with a discrete object. And I think that this is because I read the book. I think my only understanding of something similar was the MacGuffin before I read this chapter. So,
yeah,
my mind has been expanded by reading Csicsery-Ronay, which is uncomfortable sometimes.
Very true.
I will deal with it.
So I have a couple of questions for you about a couple of works that I'm interested to know what you think the novum, in which I'm interested to see what you think the novum is.
Okay.
The first that I'm interested in is Speaker for the Dead.
Oh, this is like pop quiz. I like it. Oh God. I'm gonna go with possibly the construction of, or perhaps the interpretation of the other. And the other is this culture, it's the behaviors of this culture, of this alien species. And of course, like everyone who's read Speaker for the Dead is going to remember the core misunderstanding, which is, the aliens essentially kill several humans and plant trees in their rib cages. And, spoiler alert there, sorry. But this is something which the humans interpret as an aggressive act, and it requires extensive research and compassion to come to realize that when this alien culture was doing this, it was not in fact a hostile act, but a celebratory and honoring act. So I don't know. What do you think? I like the question.
I absolutely was going in the right direction. I love how you phrased that, though, because I was going to say something very similar to what you said.
Yes.
Yeah. Which I feel bad because I'm like, no, I wasn't actually quizzing you. I was like, what is the central? Because it's almost like Ender's Game, which is the book that so Speaker for the Dead is a sequel to Ender's Game. It's set several thousand years after Ender's Game. However, because of the awesome vagaries of physics and relativity, some of the same characters who are in Ender's Game are also in Speaker for the Dead. And I won't add much more to Kendra's synopsis other than to say that in Ender's Game, you also have sort of a drawn-out confrontation indirectly between humans and aliens. But in Speaker for the Dead, I think that notion of the other and how the other is constructed and how we understand the other is very much at the center and is the novum, I think, in that book.
And so then, can I throw a pop quiz at you?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, His Dark Materials. What do you think the novum is?
Ooh. So my possibly
there's such pleasure in turning this around and making note of the fact that I'm not the only one.
Yeah.
Who struggles to find the words for it. I think novums are hard.
So my possibly unpopular read of the His Dark Materials trilogy, which for those of you who have not yet had the pleasure, is a 3-volume retelling of Paradise Lost. The books are The Golden Compass, if you're reading it in the US. If you're reading in the UK, or I think around the world, then Northern Lights. Followed by The Subtle Knife. Followed by The Amber Spyglass. So my unpopular opinion, possibly, is that I really like The Amber Spyglass and what happens, and the burgeoning relationship between Lyra and Will, and then what has to happen afterwards.
Burgeoning.
So what I would identify
they snog for like 2 chapters.
They do. It's anyway, what I would identify as the novum for his Dark Materials is not the parallel worlds, not the war between heaven and earth, not the alethiometer, not the subtle knife, but dust. What do you think?
Well, I mean, this is a convenient time to circle back to the comment that I made before, where you can have multiple novums. And I think if you're reading his Dark Materials, dust is the connective tissue that ties chapters together, that ties characters together, that ties worlds together, quite literally, and of course the entire trilogy. So in terms of looking at the soul of a book, I think that has to be a recognized component. When I read, I mean, and I have to admit this too, that I only just finished reading the second and third books a couple of months ago. I have read the first book several times, but I had only read the whole thing straight through once. I found it was actually Lyra herself. The mythology of Lyra, she is the expected child, she's the prophesied child, she's also the unpredictable element and the element that consistently violates social norms, physics, the realms of physics.
Yeah.
She's the transgressive element there.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right, because the witches have the prophecy, don't they, that she's fated to bring an end to fate without realizing what she's doing.
So I think she is the unknowable element. And what bothered me, that doesn't bother you, but what bothered me about the end of the book, even more than just way too much time dedicated to children snogging each other, is the fact that she becomes utterly predictable. The moment that Will's future happiness is called into question, she becomes the lover who must do right by her beloved. And that's a very predictable storyline. So throughout the entire series, she's transgressive, and then all of a sudden she becomes very conventional. And that does bother me, because that's the soul of the book. I don't know, to me. But I agree that dust is one novum. So yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to necessarily argue with each other's novums. I think yours is valid 100%.
And I really like Lyra as a novum. And Dust is maybe the safer choice here. For those of you, again, who have not had the pleasure of reading his Dark Materials, particles of dust are particles of consciousness. We see them animating different technologies. We see them flowing between worlds. We see them actually rendered as angels as multiple points, even though we also see angels as not exactly corporeal beings, but beings that folks like us, humans, can interact with, can talk with. But dust as like I don't want to say an indivisible particle, because I don't know that the book cares about that too much, but as a very, very small piece of matter, is intelligent and is very central to the progression of the three books. Loss of dust and gain of dust.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I 100% agree.
All right. So my last, what is the novum question I want to ask you is a book in which the novum might be the title. And that book is The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy.
Yeah. I mean, again, it's definitely a novum. It, too, provides connective tissue in a very literal way. It is... But in some ways, it is also a MacGuffin, you know?
Yes.
Like, it's a thing that allows the plot to happen and allows the greater conversations about the nature of reality, the nature of religion, the nature of humanity, the nature of humanity. it allows those conversations to happen, and they wouldn't otherwise if we didn't have this really fantastical object.
Yes.
However, I also think it does operate on a metaphorical level in quite a few ways that would open it up to being more than just a MacGuffin. So I will give you the fact that it is a novum. I don't think it is the only one, again, and I think part of the reason why I get there is my background with reading and watching and then teaching this text in at least 3 different forms. The radio broadcasts, the book, the movie. I think they're all fantastic, and they all encapsulate this notion that life is more than settling down. And I think that's a bit too vague to be a novum, but I think underneath that assumption is the novum, and the novum is the questionable foundation of reality, perhaps. I don't know. I don't even know.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that this is a book, a series really, where both in terms of adaptations of The Hitchhiker's Guide and also the book series itself, where there are lots of novums. I would add to that improbability as a concept, even though it's not necessarily new, but improbability as it's rendered in this book is definitely an essential quality of this particular fiction in a way that I have never seen before, have never seen since, and it's really lovely and important.
And I think as someone who comes from a background, an evangelical, conservative, Christian, Republican, white, whatever background that I do, I was taught growing up that humans are inherently broken, that when we sinned, we became completely irredeemable except by the grace of God. Like, Bible quote right there. And there's a real fatalism to Christianity, which is one of the things that drives me away from it. And for all of its fatalism and its nihilism, The Hitchhiker's Guide for the Galaxy has the opposite assumption. I think that people are at the core creative, imaginative, unpredictable, chaotic, but good. And Zaphod Beeblebrox is a great example of the chaotic side of things. But people in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I'm using people in the broadest sense to describe all characters, they're inherently good in a very special way. And so despite the universe, imploding on a regular basis, or planets being destroyed and God not being real, the books, the radio broadcasts, the movie, it's fantastically optimistic and compassionate and enthusiastic about life and living. And so when I think of novums and them being the soul of a text, I think of that peculiar blend of nihilism with optimism. So, that, I don't know. I haven't quite put my finger on what the novum is beneath that, but that's where I'm headed.
Yeah, and if you, dear listeners, are interested in another discussion of that peculiar blend of nihilism or pessimism and optimism, check back when we talk about Octavia Butler.
Yes, a great point there. And we will talk about Octavia Butler in the future.
Yes.
But okay, so we've looked at novums and a variety of texts.
Yes.
Now we've done the application side of Csicsery-Ronay.
We've done the pop quiz side of Csicsery-Ronay.
We've done the pop quiz.
Yeah.
May he turn over in his grave, which is not yet dug because he's alive.
Yes, he's very alive.
Yes. But how do we feel about having done this? Is it useful to identify what makes
Yeah.
A novum?
What a good question. So I sort of view this two ways. First way is that this is really kind of pop quizable. Like, this is an easy way to say, what is it about science fiction that's science fictional? Oh, well, it's the novum, the central imaginary novelty. Well, what does novum mean? Well, here are some definitions. How do we trace this concept? Well, here are some thinkers. So in that way, it could become very rote and sterile and uninteresting and not something living and dancing and interacting with texts as they enter the world. But on the other hand, like our reading of Star Trek in which the novum is intergalactic governance, or reading of the culture in which the novum is the relationship between humans and minds, really opens up those works, makes them seem new again in a way that they haven't, because I picked up my first culture book like half a decade ago. I grew up with Star Trek, so, I saw my first Star Trek episode probably before I can remember, because I was born in the same way I was born in the same year that Next Generation premiered. So it's hard in some ways to view things that I know so well as new, and yet this allowed me to do that, to see them in a different light. So I think that it can go either way. What I would say is, if I was teaching a class on science fiction, I don't know that I would necessarily introduce students to this concept, because I think it could be more limiting than expanding. But I do think it's something that's really awesome and useful for other fans to know about as a way to think about some of their favorite works, or maybe think about works that they haven't yet come across, and thinking about what the novums might be. What do you think?
I agree. I think what's useful to me about the novum is when we use it to open up new possibilities for consideration. And there's a beautiful quote in this chapter of Csicsery-Ronay, which says that the novum dislodges anthropocentrism without providing any means to recoup the loss. And I think while that's the language of loss, what he's actually trying to say there is it forces us to look beyond ourselves and our routine interpretations of texts to kind of dig into something more meaningful than just this happened and then this happened and then this happened. They used this object, and then, it takes us beyond plot and characters and the basic sort of formulaic structures of a text to something more meaningful. What's not useful about it is the limitation that you talk about. If we talk about the novum as something that text can be distilled down to. So, he even talks about in the chapter how once fictions cross a certain threshold of complexity, it becomes difficult to pin down exactly what the novum premise is. And I think we need to be really cautious about trying to force a simple novum premise on any text and say, this could be a novum. This is one of several novums, but never say this is the only novum of a text. Unless it's something like a very simplistic fairy tale or something. I think we want to celebrate text. We want to open up text to further inquiry. We want to be nerds about things.
Right.
We can't be nerds about something if we're like, well, this is all it is. So the end.
We want novums to, as you so wonderfully said earlier in the podcast, to really be the soul of a work. And it takes work to understand what that soul is and to interpret it and to really appreciate it. What we don't want is for the novum concept to take the soul out of a work.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's all about putting the soul back in there.
It is.
Cram it in,
just sort of stuff it on in there.
Pack that stuffing back in, baby. Once you tear off that teddy bear's arm, you better get it off. Okay, I'm going to stop there.
And on that note.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us in our discussion of Csicsery-Ronay. the second beauty of science fiction as pulled from his marvelous work of science fiction analysis, The Seven Beauties of Science Fiction. You can find us online at www.imaginaries.us. You can also find us on SoundCloud and iTunes, and we would really appreciate your feedback by either of these mediums. If you give us a star rating or a review or a like on SoundCloud, that really helps boost our egos a little bit and keep us from feeling like we're talking to just each other, which I mean is great. I love you, Tony. You're great.
I think it would be great to just have these conversations, but podcast.
Yeah. So, we would appreciate your feedback and insight, dear listeners, and we would also appreciate your suggestions. If there are texts that you think that we need to be looking at and reviewing on this podcast, please go ahead and let us know, and we would love to oblige because we're nerds who love consuming new things.
Yes.
So hop online. You can also find us on Twitter. Our handle is imaginary_pod. And we are trying to list our podcast links there as well as actually interact with real people. So if you're a real person who wants to interact with us, you can do that on Twitter.
You can.
All right. Well, thanks again for listening, and we will see you next week for a discussion of
some fantastic beasts and where to find them. And we're not just talking about fantastic beasts and where to find them.
Although we also are doing that.
We will do that, yes.
It's a jungle out there, people. We'll also be talking about the live-action adaptation of The Jungle Book.
Absolutely.
So, tune in next time. Thanks, guys.
Bye.